In the summer of 1895, on the cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island, a woman stood alone in a ballroom that had cost more than some European nations spent on their palaces in a decade. The walls around her were covered in gold leaf, applied so thickly that the shimmer never faded, even in candlelight. The marble beneath her feet had been quarried from the same veins that supplied the builders of Versailles. But Alva Vanderbilt, the woman who had demanded every ounce of that gold, every slab of that marble, was not smiling. She had won the battle to build the most expensive summer cottage in America. She had forced her daughter into a marriage with a British duke, and yet within 3 years of Marble House's completion, she would abandon it entirely, divorcing her husband William Kissam Vanderbilt in one of the most scandalous separations of the Gilded Age, walking away from the fortune that had built the mansion, and leaving behind a palace that would stand for more than a century as a monument not to happiness, but to the suffocating weight of social ambition. This is not a story about architectural beauty. It is a story about the cost of perfection, about what happens when human beings attempt to build their way into immortality, about a woman who believed that marble and gold could purchase dignity, only to discover that the very fortress she constructed became her prison. But to understand how Marble House became a symbol of everything that went wrong with Gilded Age excess, we must return to the beginning. To the muddy streets of Mobile, Alabama, where a young girl named Alva Erskine Smith learned that in America, beauty and money were not enough. You needed something else. You needed power. And you needed to be willing to destroy anything that stood between you and the world you believed you deserved. Tonight we will move slowly through the construction, the design, the astonishing wealth that built Marble House. We will walk through its rooms, measure its dimensions, and calculate the extraordinary cost of its existence. We will examine the lives lived within its walls, the compromises made, the suffering endured. And at the end, we will ask a simple question. When you build a palace to prove your worth, and the palace becomes more famous than the life you lived inside it, what exactly have you won? Let us begin where all great fortunes begin. Not with marble, not with gold, but with ambition, desperation, and a family willing to do whatever it took to rise above the world that tried to keep them small. Alva Erskine Smith was born in Mobile, Alabama in 1853 into a family that understood the fragility of Southern aristocracy. Her father, Murray Forbes Smith, was a cotton merchant and planter who had built a modest fortune before the Civil War devastated the economy of the American South. When Alva was still a child, the Smith family made the decision that would define her entire existence. They left Alabama and moved to New York City, then to Paris, where Alva spent her formative years among the drawing rooms and boulevards of Second Empire France. She learned French. She studied the architecture of the Petit Trianon and the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. She observed how European aristocracy wielded culture, beauty, and spectacle as instruments of power, and she absorbed a lesson that would shape everything she built in her lifetime. In a world that refused to grant women legal authority or economic independence, the only power available was the power of display. When Alva returned to New York in her late teens, she entered a society that was rapidly transforming. The old Knickerbocker families, descendants of Dutch colonial settlers, still controlled the social architecture of Manhattan, but beneath them a new class was rising. These were the railroad magnates, the steel barons, the shipping tycoons, families whose wealth was so vast and so recently acquired that it terrified the established elite. The Vanderbilts were among the most powerful of these new dynasties. Cornelius Vanderbilt, known as the Commodore, had built the largest fortune in America through shipping and railroads, amassing an estimated $100 million by the time of his death in 1877. When adjusted for inflation to modern values, that fortune would exceed $230 billion today, making Cornelius Vanderbilt one of the wealthiest individuals in human history. But wealth, in Gilded Age New York, was not the same as acceptance. The old families despised the Vanderbilts. They called them vulgar, uneducated, socially unfit. And for Alva Smith, who had returned from Paris with refined tastes and no fortune of her own, this presented both an obstacle and an opportunity. In 1875, at the age of 22, Alva married William Kissam Vanderbilt, the grandson of the Commodore. William was shy, gentle, and entirely uninterested in the brutal social combat that defined New York's elite circles. But Alva was interested. She understood that marriage was not about love. It was about leverage. And with the Vanderbilt fortune behind her, she could wage the kind of war that no woman in America had ever attempted. She could force her way into a society that despised her, not through charm or subtlety, but through spectacle so overwhelming that resistance became impossible. Her first victory came in 1883 when she orchestrated the most famous costume ball in American history at the Vanderbilt Mansion on Fifth Avenue. The ball cost approximately $250,000, which in 1883 currency was a sum so vast that newspapers struggled to convey its meaning to working-class readers. Adjusted for inflation, the ball cost approximately $7.5 million in today's money. More than 1,200 guests attended dressed as French royalty, Venetian nobles, and Renaissance courtiers. Alva herself appeared as a Venetian princess, dripping in jewels and gold embroidery. The ball was covered in newspapers across the country and Europe, and overnight the Vanderbilts were no longer pariahs. They were American royalty. Alva had proven something fundamental. In America, where there was no hereditary aristocracy, you could build aristocracy from scratch. All it required was money, ruthlessness, and a willingness to overwhelm your enemies with beauty, so extreme they had no choice but to surrender. But Alva did not stop with a single ball. She wanted something permanent. She wanted a structure that would outlast her lifetime, a palace that would stand as proof that she had conquered not just New York society, but history itself. And so, in the late 1880s, she turned her attention to Newport, Rhode Island. Newport had been a summer retreat for wealthy families since the early 19th century, but by the 1880s, it was transforming into something unprecedented. The wealthiest families in America, the Astors, the Belmonts, the Vanderbilts, were constructing enormous summer estates along the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. These were not homes. They were declarations. The families called them cottages, a term so absurd in its understatement that it became a kind of aristocratic joke. The cottages of Newport were palaces, some containing 50, 60, 70 rooms, built with materials imported from Europe, designed by the most celebrated architects in the world. And Alva Vanderbilt, who had already proven she could dominate New York, decided she would build the most expensive, the most opulent, the most astonishing cottage Newport had ever seen. In 1889, William Kissam Vanderbilt purchased a parcel of land on Bellevue Avenue in Newport. The land measured approximately 12 acres, positioned on a slight elevation with views of the Atlantic Ocean to the south. The purchase price for the land is not definitively recorded in surviving documents, but contemporary real estate transactions in Newport suggest the cost was likely between $100,000 and $150,000. Adjusted for inflation, that would be approximately $3 to $4.5 million in modern currency. But the land itself was insignificant compared to what Alva intended to build upon it. She hired Richard Morris Hunt, the most famous architect in America. Hunt had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American to do so, and he had already designed the Vanderbilt family's massive chateau on Fifth Avenue in New York. Hunt understood Alva's vision because he shared it. He believed that American architecture should not apologize for its wealth. It should embrace European grandeur, replicate it, and exceed it. When Alva told him she wanted a house based on the Petit Trianon at Versailles, Hunt did not hesitate. He began drafting plans for a structure that would be built almost entirely of marble. Construction began in 1890. The design Hunt produced was modeled directly on the Petit Trianon, the small neoclassical chateau built by King Louis XV at Versailles between 1762 and 1768. But Marble House was not a replica. It was an American reinterpretation, larger, heavier, more ornate. The exterior walls were clad in white marble, quarried from the same sources in Europe that had supplied Versailles. The marble was shipped across the Atlantic in massive blocks, transported by rail to Newport, and then carved on site by Italian and French craftsmen. The construction timeline was extraordinarily compressed. Hunt and Alva wanted the house completed in less than 3 years, a schedule that required hundreds of workers, many of them European artisans, brought to America specifically for this project. The cost of constructing Marble House is one of the most astonishing figures in American architectural history. The total expenditure was $11 million. This figure, recorded in Vanderbilt family financial documents and later confirmed by historians, includes the cost of materials, labor, furnishings, and interior decoration. In 1892 currency, $11 million was an almost incomprehensible sum. To provide context, the United States federal government budget for that year was approximately $345 million, meaning that Marble House cost roughly 3% of the entire annual budget of the federal government. Adjusted for inflation to modern values, $11 million in 1892 is equivalent to approximately $360 million today. But even that figure understates the true cost, because inflation calculators cannot account for the scarcity and value of the specific materials used. The gold leaf alone, applied to walls, ceilings, and decorative elements throughout the house, would be nearly impossible to replicate at any price in the modern era. William Kissam Vanderbilt gave Marble House to Alva as a birthday gift in 1892. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe the presentation as one of the most romantic gestures in Gilded Age society, a husband bestowing a palace upon his wife, but those who knew Alva understood the truth. Marble House was not a gift, it was a weapon. It was proof that Alva Vanderbilt could command resources on a scale that rivaled European monarchs. It was a structure designed to humiliate every other woman in Newport, to make their cottages appear modest, their wealth seemed small. And it worked. When Marble House was completed in 1892, it became the most talked about building in America, a symbol of American ambition, excess, and the terrifying power of a single woman who refused to accept the limitations society tried to impose upon her. But even as Marble House rose on the cliffs of Newport, cracks were forming in the foundation of Alva's marriage. William Kissam Vanderbilt was not the man Alva had needed him to be. He was passive, disinterested in society, more comfortable on his yacht than in the ballrooms his wife had conquered. And Alva, who had spent her entire life fighting, was beginning to realize that the palace she had built might become the most beautiful prison she would ever know. The marble was in place, the gold was gleaming, the structure stood complete, but the story of Marble House was only beginning, because what Alva Vanderbilt had built was not a home. It was a monument to a battle that could never truly be won. To walk through Marble House is to understand what $11 million meant in 1892. It meant that every surface, every wall, every ceiling, every doorway was treated not as mere architecture, but as a statement of dominance. The structure that Richard Morris Hunt designed covered approximately 11,000 square feet of interior space, spread across 4 floors including the ground level, the main floor, the second floor, and the servants' quarters in the attic. The house contained 50 rooms in total, though the exact count varies slightly depending on whether one includes service corridors and storage areas. Of those 50 rooms, 14 were considered principal rooms, the spaces where family and guests would gather, dine, dance, and display themselves. The remaining rooms were bedrooms, dressing rooms, bathrooms, and the hidden infrastructure that made luxurious life possible: kitchens, pantries, laundry rooms, storage closets, and servants' quarters. The footprint of the house measured approximately 100 feet wide and 70 feet deep, creating a compact, almost square plan that maximized the impact of the marble exterior while keeping the interior spaces intimate and controlled. This was not a sprawling estate like the Breakers, which would be built nearby just a few years later. Marble House was designed to feel concentrated, almost jewel-like, a single perfect object rather than a collection of wings and annexes. The roof was flat in the French style, topped with a low balustrade that concealed the roofline and gave the structure the severe classical proportions of an 18th century French chateau. The exterior, as we have already noted, was clad entirely in white marble, but the interior was something altogether different. The interior was gold, not metaphorically, not as an accent. Gold as the dominant material, applied in sheets of gold leaf so thick that the walls shimmered even in dim light, creating an atmosphere that contemporary visitors described as overwhelming, almost oppressive in its brilliance. The entrance to Marble House was positioned on the north facade, facing Bellevue Avenue. Guests arrived by carriage, passing through iron gates and ascending a short drive to the front portico, supported by 4 massive Corinthian columns. The front door was bronze, weighing approximately 10 tons, the single heaviest door ever installed in an American residence at that time. The door required 2 footmen to open, a detail that Alva insisted upon because she wanted visitors to understand, before they even stepped inside, that this was not a house built on a human scale. This was a house built to intimidate. Beyond the bronze door lay the entrance hall, a relatively modest space by Marble House standards, measuring approximately 20 feet by 30 feet. The floor was laid with black and white marble in a checkerboard pattern, a design lifted directly from French neoclassical palaces. The walls were clad in pale yellow marble, and the ceiling, though not gold-leafed, was decorated with intricate plasterwork in classical motifs. The entrance hall was intentionally restrained because it served as a transition, a moment of calm before the visitor was confronted with the true scale of Alva's ambition. From the entrance hall, guests moved directly into the gold room, and it was here that the purpose of Marble House became unmistakable. The gold room measured approximately 26 feet by 42 feet, with ceilings rising to a height of 22 feet. Every surface in the room, with the exception of the floor, was covered in gold. The walls were panelled in carved wood, overlaid with gold leaf. The ceiling was divided into ornamental coffers, each one gilded and decorated with classical figures and garlands. The fireplace, positioned on the western wall, was framed in red marble and topped with a gold leaf mantelpiece so elaborate that contemporary photographs struggled to convey its 3-dimensional depth. Above the fireplace hung a massive mirror framed in gold, reflecting the light from the crystal chandeliers and multiplying the brilliance of the room into something that visitors described as almost blinding. The furniture in the gold room was designed by Hunt and executed by French and Italian craftsmen specifically for this space. The chairs, sofas, and tables were carved from dark wood, then gilded and upholstered in crimson silk damask. The cost of furnishing the gold room alone exceeded $100,000, approximately $3 million in today's currency. This was a room where no expense was considered excessive, where every element was selected not for comfort, but for impact, and the impact was calculated. Alva wanted anyone who entered the gold room to feel small, diminished, overpowered by the sheer accumulation of wealth displayed on the walls and ceiling above them. Adjacent to the gold room was the dining room, a space designed to host formal dinners for up to 30 guests. The dining room measured approximately 30 feet by 36 feet, with ceilings that rose to a height of 24 feet. Unlike the gold room, the dining room was not gilded. Instead, Hunt clad the walls in pink Numidian marble, a rare stone quarried in Algeria that had been used in ancient Roman construction. The choice of Numidian marble was deliberate. Alva wanted the dining room to evoke the grandeur of imperial Rome, and Hunt obliged by designing the space as a kind of Roman atrium with pilasters and columns supporting a coffered ceiling decorated in pale blue and white. The floor was laid with dark green marble, creating a color contrast with the pink walls that was startling and, to some visitors, unsettling. The dining table was a single piece of mahogany, custom built to seat 30, and the chairs were upholstered in pale green silk to match the floor. The centerpiece of the dining room was the fireplace, carved from pink marble and topped with a bronze relief depicting classical figures in a bacchanal scene. Above the fireplace, set into the wall, was a painting of Alva herself, dressed as a Renaissance noblewoman, gazing down at her guests with an expression that contemporary accounts described as imperious. The painting was commissioned from a French artist whose name had been lost to history, though the work itself still hangs in Marble House today, a reminder that this room was never meant to be neutral. It was a throne room, and Alva was the throne. Beyond the dining room lay the library, a space that, in contrast to the gold room and dining room, was designed to feel intimate and scholarly. The library measured approximately 24 feet by 28 feet, with ceilings that rose to only 16 feet, creating a sense of enclosure that was absent in the larger public rooms. The walls were panelled in dark walnut, carved with intricate Renaissance-style reliefs depicting classical philosophers, poets, and mythological figures. The ceiling was coffered and decorated in dark green and gold, and the floor was covered in a Turkish carpet that muffled sound and created an atmosphere of quiet contemplation. The library contained approximately 2,000 volumes, though it is unclear how many of these books were actually read by the Vanderbilts. The collection included French literature, English poetry, classical texts in translation, and contemporary novels, all bound in leather and arranged on shelves that ran floor to ceiling along 3 walls. The library was one of the few rooms in Marble House where Alva could retreat from the performative demands of Gilded Age society. It was a private space, rarely shown to guests, and furnished with comfortable leather chairs and small tables designed for reading and writing. But even here, the impulse towards display was inescapable. The fireplace in the library was carved from dark green marble, topped with a bronze relief depicting a classical scene of learning, and the mantelpiece was crowded with small bronze sculptures, porcelain vases, and other decorative objects that Alva had collected during her travels in Europe. From the library, a narrow corridor led to the ballroom, and it was the ballroom that represented the culmination of Alva's vision for Marble House. The ballroom measured approximately 31 feet by 49 feet, with ceilings that soared to a height of 30 feet, making it the tallest and most imposing space in the house. The walls were covered in gold leaf, applied in such thick layers that the surface appeared almost three-dimensional, rippling with light as guests moved through the space. The ceiling was divided into panels, each one decorated with painted classical scenes surrounded by gilded plasterwork so intricate that it resembled lace. The floor was laid with parquet in a sunburst pattern, polished to a mirror shine, and the windows, which ran floor to ceiling along the southern wall, looked out over the lawns and the Atlantic Ocean beyond. The ballroom could accommodate approximately 200 guests for a formal ball, though the actual capacity depended on how densely the room was filled. During major social events, Alva would have the furniture removed entirely, leaving only the chandeliers, the gold walls, and the bodies of New York's elite circulating through the space in an elaborate performance of wealth and status. The acoustics of the ballroom were famously poor. The gold leaf and hard marble surfaces reflected sound in ways that made conversation difficult and music distorted. But Alva did not care about acoustics. She cared about spectacle, and the ballroom delivered spectacle in a way that no other room in Newport could match. On the second floor of Marble House were the bedrooms, and it was here that the structure revealed its true purpose. There were 10 bedrooms in total, each one designed for a specific member of the family or a particular category of guest. Alva's bedroom, the largest and most elaborate, measured approximately 24 feet by 30 feet, with ceilings rising to 18 feet. The walls were panelled in pale blue silk damask, and the ceiling was painted with classical scenes of clouds and cherubs. The furniture, designed by Hunt and executed by French craftsmen, included a massive 4-poster bed carved from mahogany and gilded, a dressing table with an oversized mirror framed in gold, and several upholstered chairs arranged near the fireplace. The fireplace itself was carved from white marble and topped with a gold leaf mantelpiece decorated with garlands and classical figures. William Kissam Vanderbilt's bedroom was adjacent to Alva's, connected by a short corridor but clearly separated, a physical manifestation of the emotional distance that had begun to define their marriage. William's bedroom was smaller than Alva's, measuring approximately 20 feet by 24 feet, and it was decorated in a more masculine style, with dark wood paneling, green silk wallpaper, and heavy leather furniture. The ceiling was lower, only 14 feet, creating a sense of enclosure that suggested retreat rather than display. William's bedroom contained a small writing desk positioned near the window, where he could look out over the ocean and perhaps imagine himself anywhere but Newport. The remaining bedrooms were reserved for guests and for Alva's children, Consuelo, William Jr. and Harold. Consuelo's bedroom, which we will return to later, was decorated in pale pink and white, with delicate furniture designed for a young woman. The guest bedrooms varied in size and decoration, but all followed the same principle. No expense spared, no detail overlooked. Every surface treated as an opportunity to remind visitors that they were sleeping in a palace built by a woman who had conquered American society through sheer force of will. The third floor of Marble House was reserved for servants, and it was here that the structure's dual nature became the most apparent. The servants' quarters consisted of approximately 20 small rooms, each one measuring roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, with ceilings that sloped under the eaves of the roof. The walls were plain plaster painted white, the floors were bare wood. There were no fireplaces, no gold leaf, no marble. The servants' quarters were designed to be invisible, tucked away in the attic where the family and their guests would never venture. The servants themselves, who numbered approximately 30 during the summer season, entered and exited the house through separate doors, used separate staircases, and were expected to move through the main floors silently, efficiently, without drawing attention to their presence. They were the hidden mechanism that made Marble House function, the human infrastructure that allowed Alva and her family to live as though they were French aristocrats in the age of Louis XV. But Marble House was not Versailles. It was a copy built 3,000 miles from the original, constructed in a country that had no aristocracy, no monarchy, no hereditary titles. It was a house built by a woman who believed that if she could replicate the architecture of European power, she could claim that power for herself, and for a time it worked. Marble House became the most famous residence in Newport, a symbol of American ambition and excess that drew visitors from across the world. But architecture, no matter how expensive, no matter how beautiful, cannot change the fundamental realities of human life. And the realities of Alva Vanderbilt's life in the summer of 1892 were beginning to fracture in ways that no amount of gold leaf could conceal. To understand what it meant to live inside Marble House, one must first understand what the Newport summer season demanded of those who participated in it. The season began in late June and extended through early September, a period of approximately 10 weeks during which the wealthiest families in America abandoned their city residences and retreated to the cliffs of Rhode Island. But retreat is the wrong word. The Newport season was not about rest. It was about performance. Every day was structured around a series of social obligations, morning calls, afternoon teas, evening dinners, late-night balls. The schedule was relentless, exhausting, and entirely deliberate. The families who built the cottages of Newport were engaged in a competition that had no finish line, no objective measure of victory. They competed through display, through excess, through the subtle and not so subtle demonstration of wealth, taste, and social dominance. And Marble House, with its $11 million price tag and its walls covered in gold, was Alva Vanderbilt's entry into that competition. The daily routine inside Marble House during the summer season followed a pattern that was repeated, with minor variations, throughout the 10 weeks of the Newport calendar. The household staff, approximately 30 individuals during peak season, began their work before dawn. The servants' day started at 5 o'clock in the morning, when the kitchen staff lit the stoves and began preparing breakfast. The kitchen was located in the basement of Marble House, a large utilitarian space with white-tiled walls, cast-iron stoves, and long wooden tables where food was prepared and plated. The kitchen staff consisted of a head chef, typically French, 2 assistant cooks, and several kitchen maids who handled the washing, cleaning, and basic food preparation. The head chef at Marble House during the early 1890s earned approximately $1,200 per year, a substantial salary for domestic staff at the time, equivalent to roughly $38,000 in modern currency. The kitchen maids earned far less, approximately $250 per year, roughly $7,900 today. By 6 o'clock in the morning, the housemaids were at work in the main rooms of the house, dusting the gold leaf, polishing the marble floors, emptying the fireplaces, and ensuring that every surface was immaculate before the family woke. The housemaids worked in silence, trained never to speak unless spoken to, never to make unnecessary noise, never to be seen by family members or guests unless summoned. They moved through the house like ghosts, invisible yet essential, maintaining the illusion that Marble House cleaned itself, that the gold never tarnished, that the marble never dulled. The Vanderbilt family typically woke at 8 o'clock in the morning. Alva's personal maid, a French woman whose name does not appear in surviving household records, would enter Alva's bedroom at precisely 8 o'clock, open the curtains, and prepare Alva's morning tea. Alva would spend the next hour in her bedroom, drinking tea, reviewing her correspondence and planning the day's social obligations. She kept detailed notebooks in which she recorded every invitation received, every event attended, every social slight and triumph. These notebooks, some of which survive in the Vanderbilt family archives, reveal a woman who approached social life with the strategic precision of a military commander. She tracked who attended which dinners, who wore which gowns, who spoke to whom, and who was rising or falling in the invisible hierarchy of Newport society. Breakfast was served at 9:30 in the morning in the dining room, though the meal was rarely attended by the entire family. William Kissam Vanderbilt preferred to take his breakfast alone in his bedroom, or more often skip breakfast entirely, and spend his mornings on his yacht, the Alva, a vessel that measured 285 feet in length and was widely considered one of the finest private yachts in the world. William's absence at breakfast was accepted, almost expected. He had little interest in the social rituals that consumed Alva's attention, and by the early 1890s, the marriage had settled into a pattern of polite distance, with William pursuing his maritime interests and Alva pursuing her social ambitions. The children, Consuelo, William Jr., and Harold, were expected to attend breakfast, though their participation in the Newport season was limited by their ages. Consuelo, born in 1877, was 15 years old during the summer of 1892. The year Marble House was completed. She was already being groomed for the role that Alva had determined she would play: marriage into European aristocracy. William Jr. and Harold, younger and less central to Alva's social plans, spent much of their time with tutors and governesses, largely shielded from the intensity of the Newport season. After breakfast, Alva would retire to her bedroom to dress for the day, a process that typically required 2 hours and the assistance of her personal maid. Gilded Age fashion demanded multiple layers: corsets, petticoats, stockings, gowns with elaborate fastenings, hats, gloves, jewelry. Alva owned hundreds of gowns, many of them custom-made by Parisian designers, and she changed her clothing multiple times throughout the day, depending on the nature of her social obligations. A morning call required a different gown than an afternoon tea, which required a different gown than an evening dinner. The cost of maintaining Alva's wardrobe during the Newport season is difficult to estimate precisely, but contemporary accounts suggest she spent upwards of $50,000 per year on clothing alone, approximately $1.6 million in modern currency. By 11 o'clock in the morning, Alva would depart Marble House in her carriage to make morning calls, a ritual that required visiting the homes of other Newport families to leave calling cards, exchange pleasantries, and gather intelligence about the social landscape. The calling ritual was governed by strict rules. The call could last no longer than 15 minutes. Conversation was restricted to safe, neutral topics: the weather, upcoming social events, mutual acquaintances. Any discussion of politics, money, or personal matters was considered vulgar. The purpose of the morning call was not conversation, it was presence. By making calls, Alva reminded the other families of Newport that she existed, that she was watching, that she was a force to be acknowledged. Alva would return to Marble House by 1 o'clock in the afternoon, at which point luncheon was served in the dining room. Luncheon was a lighter meal than dinner, typically consisting of 4 or 5 courses: soup, fish, a meat course, salad, and dessert. The meal was served by footmen in full livery, and the table was set with silver, crystal, and china that had been imported from France, specifically for use at Marble House. The cost of the tableware alone exceeded $20,000, approximately $630,000 in modern currency. After luncheon, the afternoon was reserved for social events, garden parties, tennis matches, sailing excursions, or simply sitting on the terraces of the various Newport cottages, observing the ocean and being observed by others. Alva participated in these events selectively, always calculating which invitations to accept, which to decline, and how to maximize her visibility without appearing desperate or overeager. She understood that social power in Newport was a delicate balance. Too much visibility made one seem common. Too little made one irrelevant. By 6 o'clock in the evening, Alva would return to Marble House to prepare for dinner, the most important social event of the day. Dinner during the Newport season was rarely a private family affair. Alva hosted formal dinners at Marble House at least 3 times per week, inviting between 20 and 30 guests to dine in the gold-paneled dining room beneath the portrait of herself dressed as a Renaissance noblewoman. The dinners were elaborate performances that required hours of preparation by the household staff. The menu, planned days in advance by the head chef, typically consisted of 10 to 12 courses: oysters, soup, fish, entree, sorbet, roast, salad, vegetables, dessert, fruit, cheese, and coffee. The wine list, curated by William Kissan Vanderbilt, included French champagnes, Bordeaux, and Burgundy, some of which had been purchased directly from European vineyards and stored in the wine cellar beneath Marble House. The cost of hosting a single formal dinner at Marble House exceeded $1,000, approximately $31,500 in modern currency. The dinners themselves followed a rigid protocol. Guests arrived at precisely 8 o'clock in the evening, announced by the butler at the entrance hall. They gathered in the Gold Room for cocktails, a period of carefully orchestrated small talk during which social alliances were formed, reinforced, or subtly undermined. At 8:30, the butler announced that dinner was served, and the guests proceeded to the dining room in a predetermined order based on social rank. Alva, as hostess, sat at the head of the table. William, when he attended, sat at the opposite end. The guests were arranged according to a seating chart that Alva had prepared in advance, ensuring that allies were placed together, rivals were separated, and conversational dynamics favored her interests. The meal lasted approximately 3 hours. Conversation during dinner was expected to be light, witty, and impeccably polite. Discussions of business, politics, or anything remotely serious were forbidden. The goal was not intellectual engagement. The goal was performance, the demonstration that one could navigate the complex social codes of Gilded Age Newport without appearing to try. At 11:30, the ladies retired to the Gold Room while the gentlemen remained in the dining room for cigars and brandy. By midnight, the guests departed, the servants cleared the dining room, and Marble House returned to silence. But the silence of Marble House was not peaceful. It was the silence of a structure built for display, not for living. The gold walls did not absorb sound. They reflected it, creating echoes that made private conversation impossible. The marble floors were cold even in summer, and the high ceilings made the rooms feel cavernous and impersonal. The house was designed to impress visitors, not to comfort its inhabitants. And as the summer seasons passed, the residents of Marble House began to feel the weight of the structure pressing down upon them. Consuelo, Alva's daughter, later wrote in her memoirs that she felt imprisoned at Marble House. She described the house as beautiful, but suffocating, a place where her mother's ambitions overshadowed every moment of daily life. Consuelo was not permitted to choose her own friends, her own activities, or her own future. Alva had decided by the time Consuelo was 15 that her daughter would marry into European aristocracy, preferably British, and that the marriage would cement the Vanderbilt family's position, not just in American society but on the global stage. Consuelo's feelings about this plan were irrelevant. She was a tool, a strategic asset in Alva's ongoing campaign for social dominance. William Kissan Vanderbilt, for his part, spent less and less time at Marble House as the 1890s progressed. He preferred his yacht, where he could escape the relentless social obligations of Newport and the increasingly cold relationship with his wife. The yacht became his refuge, a floating palace where he entertained friends, sailed along the eastern seaboard, and avoided the gold-lined prison that Alva had built. And Alva herself, the woman who had conceived Marble House, who had supervised every detail of its construction, who had spent $11 million to create the most opulent residence in Newport, found that the house did not bring her the satisfaction she had anticipated. She had won the competition. Marble House was universally acknowledged as the most expensive, the most beautiful, the most astonishing cottage in Newport. But winning had not resolved the fundamental emptiness at the center of her existence. The house was perfect. The social season was a triumph, and yet something was wrong. Something was missing. Something that no amount of marble, no quantity of gold, could provide. The staff of Marble House, who witnessed the daily life of the family from their invisible positions in the kitchen, the hallways, the attic bedrooms, understood the truth that the Vanderbilts could not acknowledge. Marble House was not a home. It was a monument to a war that had already been won, but could never be ended. And the cost of maintaining that monument, both financial and emotional, was beginning to exceed what any of its inhabitants could bear. The collapse of Alva Vanderbilt's marriage did not happen suddenly. It happened in stages, over years, with a slow accumulation of resentments, betrayals, and realizations that the palace she had built could not contain the life she had imagined for herself. But if we must mark a specific moment when the foundation began to crack, it would be the summer of 1895, 3 years after Marble House was completed, when Alva discovered that her husband had been conducting a long-term affair with a woman named Nellie Newstretter. The affair itself was not unusual. Wealthy men in Gilded Age America routinely maintained mistresses, and their wives were expected to ignore these arrangements with dignified silence. What made William's affair intolerable to Alva was not the existence of another woman, but the fact that it represented William's complete withdrawal from the social project that had defined Alva's entire existence. William was not simply unfaithful, he was indifferent. He had stopped attending dinners at Marble House. He spent months at a time on his yacht, sailing to Europe, to the Caribbean, anywhere that allowed him to escape Newport and the relentless performance of Gilded Age society. And Alva, who had built Marble House to cement their family's position at the apex of American society, found herself alone in a palace that had become a prison. In March of 1895, Alva made a decision that shocked American society. She filed for divorce. The divorce petition filed in New York cited William's adultery and named Nellie Newstretter as the correspondent. The news appeared in newspapers across the country within days, and the reaction was swift and brutal. Divorce in the 1890s was not merely scandalous, it was social suicide. Women who divorced their husbands were ostracized, excluded from society, treated as moral failures regardless of the circumstances, and yet Alva proceeded. She hired the most aggressive lawyers in New York, demanded a financial settlement that would allow her to maintain her lifestyle independently, and refused to compromise. The divorce settlement, finalized in March of 1896, awarded Alva a payment of $10 million, an astronomical sum that represented a significant portion of William's personal fortune. Adjusted for inflation, $10 million in 1896 is equivalent to approximately $320 million today. The settlement also granted Alva custody of their 3 children and allowed her to retain possession of several properties, though crucially, it did not include Marble House. Marble House had been given to Alva as a birthday gift in 1892, but the legal ownership remained with William. As part of the divorce settlement, William agreed to transfer full ownership of Marble House to Alva, along with an annual allowance of $100,000, approximately $3.2 million in modern currency, to cover the cost of maintaining the property. But Alva did not want Marble House. She had won the battle to keep it, but the victory felt hollow. The house was a reminder of everything she had sacrificed, everything she had endured, and everything that had failed to bring her happiness. Within months of the divorce being finalized, Alva stopped visiting Marble House entirely. She spent the summer of 1896 in Europe, and when she returned to America, she focused her attention on a new project, forcing her daughter Consuelo into marriage with Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. The marriage of Consuelo Vanderbilt and the Duke of Marlborough took place on November the 6th, 1895, just months after Alva filed for divorce. The wedding was held at St. Thomas Church in New York City, and it was attended by more than 2,000 guests, making it one of the largest society weddings in American history. But those who were close to the family understood that the marriage was not a love match. It was a transaction. The Duke of Marlborough needed money to restore Blenheim Palace, his family's ancestral estate in Oxfordshire, which had fallen into disrepair. Consuelo came with a dowry of $2.5 million in cash, approximately $80 million in modern currency, plus an annual income of $100,000 for life, approximately $3.2 million today. In exchange, Consuelo received a title, Duchess of Marlborough, and Alva received what she had wanted since she was a young woman in Mobile, Alabama, proof that she had transcended American society entirely and entered the European aristocracy. But Consuelo was miserable. She later wrote in her autobiography, published in 1953 under the title The Glitter and the Gold, that her mother had forced her into the marriage against her will. Consuelo had been in love with another man, brought her no joy, no companionship, and no escape from her mother's control. Marble House during this period stood empty for months at a time. Alva had achieved everything she set out to accomplish. She had built the most expensive cottage in Newport. She had forced her way into the highest levels of American society. She had married her daughter into British aristocracy, but none of it had brought her peace. The house, with its gold walls and marble floors, had become a monument to victories that felt increasingly meaningless. In 1909, Alva married again. Her second husband was Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, a wealthy banker and congressman who shared Alva's passion for social reform and women's suffrage. Oliver owned Belcourt Castle, another massive estate in Newport located less than a mile from Marble House. After their marriage, Alva moved into Belcourt and began to distance herself even further from the house she had built. Marble House became a secondary residence, used occasionally for social events but no longer the center of her life. Oliver Belmont died suddenly in 1908, just 4 years after marrying Alva, leaving her a widow at the age of 55. The death devastated Alva, not because she had loved Oliver more than William, but because it reminded her of the fundamental futility of her life's work. She had spent decades accumulating wealth, building palaces, forcing her way into society, and yet she was alone. The people she had married, the children she had raised, the houses she had built, none of them had delivered the dignity and respect she believed she deserved. In the years following Oliver's death, Alva transformed. She abandoned the social climbing that had defined her early life and dedicated herself to the women's suffrage movement. She donated large sums of money to suffragist organizations, hosted rallies at Marble House, and became one of the most prominent advocates for women's right to vote in America. In 1913, she opened Marble House to the public for a suffragist event, allowing thousands of women to tour the gold-paneled rooms and hear speeches on women's political rights. The event was remarkable not because of its size, but because it represented a complete inversion of everything Marble House had originally symbolized. The house that had been built to exclude, to intimidate, to demonstrate Alva's dominance over other women was now being used to empower them. But even this transformation could not erase the fundamental truth about Marble House. It was a monument to excess, to ambition, to the belief that wealth and beauty could substitute for human connection. And the cost of building and maintaining that monument was staggering, not just financially, but emotionally. The financial cost of maintaining Marble House during Alva's lifetime is difficult to calculate precisely, but surviving financial records suggest that the annual operating expenses including staff salaries, maintenance, utilities, and property taxes, exceeded $50,000 per year during the peak summer seasons, approximately $1.6 million in modern currency. Over the course of Alva's ownership, from 1892 until her death in 1933, the cumulative cost of maintaining Marble House exceeded $2 million, approximately $63 million today. This figure does not include the original construction cost of $11 million, nor does it include the cost of furnishings, artwork, and decorative objects that Alva purchased to fill the house. The emotional cost was harder to quantify, but no less real. Alva spent the final decades of her life estranged from her daughter Consuelo, who eventually divorced the Duke of Marlborough in 1921 and remarried a French aviator named Jacques Balsan. Consuelo's memoir, published after Alva's death, portrayed her mother as a tyrant, a woman so consumed by social ambition that she destroyed her own family in pursuit of status. The memoir did not mention Marble House with affection. It described the house as cold, oppressive, a place where Consuelo had felt trapped and powerless. William Kissam Vanderbilt, Alva's first husband, lived until 1920, dying at the age of 71. He remarried after the divorce, but his second marriage was brief and unhappy. He spent his final years on his yacht, the Alva, which he never renamed despite the dissolution of his marriage. He rarely spoke of Marble House in his later years, and when he did, it was with a tone of regret, as though the house represented a chapter of his life he preferred to forget. Alva herself died on January 26, 1933, at the age of 79. She died in Paris, far from Newport, far from Marble House, far from the social battlefields where she had fought so fiercely in her youth. Her obituaries in American newspapers described her as a suffragist, a reformer, a woman who had championed women's rights. They mentioned Marble House only briefly as one of several residences she had owned during her lifetime. The house that had once defined her identity had become, by the end of her life, a footnote. After Alva's death, Marble House passed to her son Harold, who had little interest in Newport society and even less interest in maintaining an 11,000-square-foot palace. Harold attempted to sell the house, but the Great Depression had devastated the market for luxury real estate, and no buyer could be found. In 1932, 1 year before Alva's death, Harold had transferred ownership of Marble House to Frederick H. Prince, a businessman who intended to use the property as a summer residence. But Prince, too, found the house difficult to maintain, and in 1963 he donated Marble House to the Preservation Society of Newport County, a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving the historic mansions of Newport. Today, Marble House is a museum. Approximately 85,000 visitors tour the house each year, walking through the gold room, the dining room, the ballroom, rooms that were designed to overwhelm, to intimidate, to demonstrate the power of a woman who believed she could build her way into history. The gold leaf still shimmers, the marble still gleams, but the rooms are empty. The furniture is roped off. The visitors move through in silence, guided by staff members who explain the dimensions, the cost, the architectural significance, but who cannot convey the suffocating weight of ambition that filled these spaces when Alva Vanderbilt walked through them more than a century ago. Marble House stands today as a monument to a very specific kind of tragedy. Not the tragedy of poverty or war or natural disaster, but the tragedy of success. Alva Vanderbilt achieved everything she set out to accomplish. She built the most expensive house in Newport. She forced her way into American society. She married her daughter into European aristocracy. And yet, at the end of her life, she was alone, estranged from her children, widowed twice, living in exile in Paris. The palace she built did not bring her happiness. It brought her isolation. And the cost of that isolation, measured in years of loneliness, broken relationships, and the quiet realization that wealth cannot substitute for love, was a price that no amount of gold could ever repay. There are buildings that tell stories of triumph, and there are buildings that tell stories of loss. Marble House tells both stories at once, and that is why it remains, more than a century after its completion, one of the most haunting structures in American architectural history. It stands on Bellevue Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island, as it has stood since 1892, its white marble facade glowing in the Atlantic sunlight, its gold-paneled rooms waiting behind bronze doors that still require two people to open. But the house is no longer what it was. It is no longer a home. It is a museum, a monument, a carefully preserved artifact of an age that believed wealth could substitute for meaning. When visitors walk through Marble House today, they see the surfaces. They see the gold leaf applied so thickly it still shimmers after more than 130 years. They see the pink Numidian marble in the dining room, the parquet floors in the ballroom, the carved wood panels in the library. They photograph the grand staircase, the crystal chandeliers, the bronze door that weighs 10 tons. They marvel at the cost. $11 million in 1892, $360 million in modern currency, and they struggle to comprehend what it means to spend that much money on a house used only 10 weeks per year. But what they cannot see, what no photograph can capture, is the atmosphere of the house when it was inhabited, the silence that filled the rooms between social events, the loneliness of a woman standing in a ballroom that cost more than most people would earn in 1,000 lifetimes, realizing that the battle she had won was not the battle she needed to fight. Alva Vanderbilt built Marble House to prove something. She built it to prove that a woman born in the devastated South, a woman with no hereditary title, no family fortune, no claim to aristocratic lineage, could rise to the pinnacle of American society through sheer force of will. And she succeeded. She built the most expensive cottage in Newport. She forced the old Knickerbocker families to acknowledge her. She married her daughter into British aristocracy. By every objective measure, she won. But winning did not bring her peace. It brought her isolation, estrangement from her children, 2 marriages that ended in divorce and death, and a final exile in Paris, far from the palace she had built to prove her worth. The question that Marble House asks, quietly, persistently, is whether there was ever a different path available to Alva. Could she have found happiness without building a monument to her ambition? Could she have raised her daughter with love instead of strategic calculation? Could she have accepted her position in society without waging war against everyone who tried to exclude her? These are impossible questions to answer, because they require us to imagine an Alva Vanderbilt who did not exist, an Alva who was content with modesty, who accepted limitations, who chose peace over victory, and that Alva, the one who might have been happy, could never have built Marble House. The house and the woman who built it were inseparable, 2 manifestations of the same desperate need to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be remembered. Marble House survives today because it is beautiful. The architecture is flawless. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The materials are some of the finest ever assembled in a private residence, but beauty alone does not explain why the house continues to haunt those who study it, those who visit it, those who spend time in its gold-paneled rooms and try to imagine what it felt like to live there. The house haunts us because it is a monument to a very specific kind of failure. Not the failure to achieve one's goals, but the failure to understand that the goals themselves were hollow. Alva Vanderbilt spent her entire life believing that if she could accumulate enough wealth, build enough palaces, force enough people to acknowledge her superiority, she would finally feel secure, respected, dignified. But security, respect, and dignity cannot be purchased. They cannot be built from marble and gold. They must come from within, from relationships, from love, from the quiet acceptance that one's worth is not determined by the size of one's house or the thickness of the gold leaf on one's walls. The Preservation Society of Newport County, which has owned Marble House since 1963, maintains the property with extraordinary care. The gold leaf is restored when necessary. The marble is cleaned and polished. The furnishings, most of which are original to the house, are preserved in climate-controlled conditions. The Society employs a staff of curators, conservators, and historians who study every aspect of the house, from the architectural plans drafted by Richard Morris Hunt to the financial records that document the staggering cost of construction and maintenance. And through this preservation work, a picture emerges of Marble House not as a home, but as a machine designed to produce a very specific effect, or intimidation, submission. The house was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be overwhelming, and it succeeded. But there is a cost to being overwhelmed. The cost is that one stops seeing the people who inhabit the space. The visitors who tour Marble House today walk through the rooms in groups, guided by docents who explain the history, the architecture, the significance. But the visitors rarely linger. They move through quickly, overwhelmed by the gold, the marble, the sheer excess of it all, and then they step outside into the sunlight and breathe deeply, relieved to be free of the oppressive beauty inside. The house does not invite contemplation. It does not encourage rest. It demands attention, and then it exhausts those who give it. Consuelo Vanderbilt, Alva's daughter, returned to Marble House only once after her mother's death. She came in the 1950s, decades after she had been forced to marry the Duke of Marlborough, decades after she had escaped her mother's control and built a new life in France. She walked through the gold room, the dining room, the ballroom where she had been displayed like a prize at her mother's social events. And according to those who accompanied her, she said very little. She looked at the gold walls, the marble floors, the portrait of her mother dressed as a Renaissance noblewoman, and then she left. She never returned. When asked later about her childhood at Marble House, she would say only that it had been a beautiful prison, and that she had spent her entire adult life trying to forget it. William Kissam Vanderbilt, Alva's first husband, never set foot in Marble House after the divorce was finalized in 1896. He spent his remaining years on his yacht sailing the world, avoiding Newport, avoiding the house that had symbolized the failure of his marriage. When he died in 1920, his obituaries mentioned Marble House only briefly, as one of several properties he had owned. The house that had cost $11 million to build, the house that had been the most talked about structure in America, had become, by the end of William's life, an embarrassment, a reminder of a marriage that had brought neither partner happiness. And yet Marble House endures. It endures because it is a perfect example of Gilded Age excess, a structure that captures, in 11,000 square feet of marble and gold, the ambitions, the cruelties, and the fundamental emptiness of an era that believed wealth could solve every problem. It endures because it is beautiful, because the craftsmanship is extraordinary, because the gold still shimmers and the marble still gleams. But most of all, it endures because it tells a story that remains relevant today. It tells the story of what happens when human beings confuse achievement with fulfillment, when they believe that the accumulation of wealth and status can substitute for love, connection, and inner peace. Marble House stands on the cliffs of Newport, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, as it has stood for more than 130 years. The waves crash against the rocks below. The tourists come and go, the gold leaf is restored, the marble is polished, and the house remains silent, beautiful, and profoundly sad, a monument to a woman who built a palace to prove her worth and discovered too late that worth cannot be built from marble and gold. It must be earned through kindness, through love, through the quiet recognition that we are all, in the end, human beings seeking connection in a world that too often values display over substance. If you visit Marble House today, stand for a moment in the gold room. Look at the walls covered in gold leaf, the ceiling decorated with classical figures, the fireplace framed in red marble, and then close your eyes and imagine what it would feel like to live in this room, to wake each morning surrounded by this much beauty, this much wealth, this much proof of your own success. And then ask yourself, would you be happy here? Would this be enough? Or would you, like Alva Vanderbilt, eventually realize that the palace you built to prove your worth had become the very thing that prevented you from finding peace? The answer if we are honest, is already written in the silence of the house itself.